During the wars for independence in Spanish America, Spain sent about 60,000 soldiers from the Iberian Peninsula. Despite the royalist defeat, Madrid did not fully recognize the independences until 1879, with Peru being the last country with which it established relations. In contrast, Portugal did not send any soldiers from the Iberian Peninsula to fight during Brazil's independence, and after its defeat, it recognized the newly formed country in 1825. If both European powers were present in their overseas territories for so many centuries, why did Portugal let go of its main colony so quickly, almost without offering any resistance? Are you interested in finding out? Alright then, stay until the end of the video. As always, let's go back to the background. And for this, it would be good for us to go back to the Napoleonic Wars. As you know, the worst enemy of the French were the British, against whom they ordered a continental blockade, the Europeans blocking each other since ancient times. Portugal, an ally of the English since 1373, the oldest active alliance in the world by the way, refuses to join the blockade. Napo's reaction: ordered the invasion of Russia, passing through Spain, and by the way, put his brother on the throne. Why not? Faced with this threat, the Portuguese court of the Braganza flees to Rio de Janeiro, the main city of its colony in Brazil. The then Queen Maria the Mad, who really was crazier than a Spaniard without electricity, she was unable to rule, so the decisions were made by her son, acting as regent, João VI of Portugal. Once they settled in Rio, it was the only time in history that a European monarchy moved its court to an overseas colony. The Braganza family opened Brazilian ports to international trade, and Brazil became an important partner of England. Remember this fact. This led to the former Brazilian colony becoming stronger. And in 1816, taking advantage of Spain's weakness in the Rio de la Plata, it occupied the eastern bank, present-day Uruguay, turning it into the Cisplatin province. Although the wars in Europe ended after Napo's defeat in 1815, it seems that King João enjoyed having his caipirinha in Copacabana. Well, the court remained in Brazil until 1820. This is when the Liberal Revolution broke out in Porto, aiming to put an end to the absolute monarchy, taking advantage of the fact that they were sunbathing in Ipanema. Juan is then forced to return to Portugal in 1821, leaving his son, the Crown Prince Pedro de Braganza, in Brazil. Once the king is back in Lisbon, the courts try to subordinate Brazil again and order Pedro to return, but he refuses in response to popular demands. Oh, what's about to happen? Under pressure from the Brazilian elites, Pedro proclaimed January 9, 1822 as the day of the Fico, that you speak Portuguese, which is quite easy to learn. Do you know what the day of staying means? Staying in Brazil and ignoring the authorities? The orders from Lisbon? The tensions finally erupted 9 months later when Pedro, on the banks of the Ipiranga River, declared independence with the famous phrase, "Independence or death." This act, known as the Cry of Ipiranga, is the first line of the Brazilian national anthem. The Empire of Brazil was then proclaimed with Pedro I as its first emperor. Although this declaration was peaceful, the Portuguese courts did not recognize Brazil's separation. What happens in these cases? That's when trouble starts. The Brazilian forces loyal to Pedro faced the Portuguese garrisons still stationed in several regions such as Maranhão, Para, Cisplatina, and Bahia, with the latter being the main stage. The Battle of Piraja stands out, considered the largest confrontation of the entire war. Roughly 5,000 troops confronted each other, with under 1,000 casualties. In the maritime theater, the Battle of Itaparica stands out, also on the coast of Bahia, where the Brazilians achieved another victory. In Cisplatina, the Brazilian forces began a siege in Montevideo, which lasted from January 1823 to March 1824. At the end of this period, the forces loyal to Portugal suffered another setback. By that time, the last Portuguese garrisons had already chosen to surrender. With no means to recover Brazil, Portugal signed the Treaty of Rio de Janeiro in 1825 under British mediation, in which it recognized the independence of its former colony, in exchange for compensation of £2 million sterling financed by a British loan, the British always looking out for their own interests. At this point, it's time to answer the question of the video. Why did Portugal give in so quickly and with almost no resistance? The loss of Brazil meant a tremendous decline for Portugal, which has allowed memes like this one to be very accurate even to this day. How did the author, a maritime power that discovered important trade routes, fall so low? The first reason is an easy one to figure out. Portugal was weakened after the Napoleonic Wars. In addition, the internal political crisis since the liberal revolution of Porto made decision-making difficult. This meant that it didn't have the logistical capacity to send a large transatlantic expedition like Spain did with Pablo Murillo. Especially because, after the Napoleonic Wars, the Atlantic was dominated by the United Kingdom, which, as I mentioned to you earlier, had become a commercial partner of Brazil. You know, a huge market like Brazil carries more weight than a centuries-old, worn-out alliance with a tiny country like Portugal. I bet that's what the British were thinking. Another factor was the peculiarity of the relationship between the warring monarchs. João VI and Pedro I of Brazil were father and son, and the conflict happened more because of pressure from the Brazilian elites than because of a family break. After the Little War, there were certain tacit agreements between both monarchs. João VI would accept this situation since the Braganza dynasty was preserved on both sides of the Atlantic. In other words, good relations were already assured. In fact, in the Treaty of 1825, the agreement was presented as a dynastic cession and not as a defeat or as an independence, even though it was in practice. Likewise, the compensation of £2 million sterling was equivalent to a current estimate of £40 million, which represented 5% of Portugal's annual gross domestic product at that time. Wouldn't European countries love to grow by 5% nowadays? This amount helped solve the economic crisis Portugal was experiencing. Now let's make a comparison with Hispanic America. Spain resisted the independence of its viceroyalties much more because they were seen as a rebellion against the crown and not as a dynastic transition. Furthermore, the United Kingdom, instead of mediating as it did in Brazil, supported the independent side with weapons and troops, which led to even more violence. Others will likely want to hear the comparison to the independence movements in Portuguese African colonies like Mozambique and Angola. These struggles took place during the 1960s and 70s, and they really were a true bloodbath. Here it's important to point out that they were different contexts. Under Salazar's dictatorship, Portugal clung to the idea that the African territories were not colonies but overseas provinces. As an isolated authoritarian state, Angola and Mozambique were vital as sources of strategic resources, oil, minerals, and agriculture. Nevertheless, the tremendous violence that was perpetrated during these episodes, and the ones we saw in more detail in this video, damaged the image of the Portuguese regime, which culminated in the Carnation Revolution, thus freeing the last Portuguese overseas possessions. So, as you can see, Portugal let go of its most important colony of all time, offering almost no resistance because of a combination of factors. The lack of logistical resources, the English dominance over Atlantic trade, the compensation received, and the peculiar nature of the relationship between the opposing rulers, who disguised the situation as a dynastic transfer. What João VI never imagined is that this would have repercussions even in today's memes. What other reason do you think Portugal had for being so permissive with Brazil's independence? Don't forget to leave your comment and subscribe to the channel. My social media links are in the description. And in case you want to watch the new videos during the premiere and have more interaction with me, donations via Patreon, Una Manito Net, or channel memberships are appreciated. See you next time.